All right. Genesis 19. God rescues Lot. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth, and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet, and then you may rise up early and go your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they laid down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot went out to the men at the entrance, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have two daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men as have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door down. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out groping for the door. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he lingered. And so the men seized him and his wife and his two daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." He said to him, "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Therefore, the name of the city was called Zoar. The sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. And then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he ruled those cities, and he over oh my goodness, and he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that God destroyed the cities of the valley. God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his two daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his two daughters, and the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine. We will lie with him, and we may preserve offspring from our father." And so they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. The next day the firstborn said to the younger, "Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and then you go in and lie with him, and that we may preserve offspring from our father." So they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben Ami, for he is the father of the Ammonites to this day. Okay, uh, so this is a very long chapter. Um, uh, and uh, like many of the other times in recent weeks, I'm not as fully prepared as I want to be with this because of the nature of my job. But um, we will get into this. But as we go through it, um, uh, I I want as much as we can to think about um, comparing and contrasting this with the previous chapter, with chapter 18. And if you weren't here last week, which is most of you, because there's a lot of you here tonight, um, I'd say go back and listen to chapter 18, and so that you can kind of get what I'm trying to say with the comparing and contrasting. Um, uh, and so, right, so the most basic structure of chapter 18 is um, you have God promising uh, you have God promising Isaac. You have Abraham being hospitable to the men, and then the promise of Isaac, and then you have them here. I can go back, and then you have the debate. You have Abraham interceding for Sodom, right? And so now we zoom in, right? The two angels um have left the angelic being that is Yahweh, and who will show up later in this. But now they're in the city, and so uh the first things that I want to contrast with the last story is, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. So this is another kind of, I talked a little bit last time about God meeting people in liminal spaces, and we have that happening again here, but it's slightly different, right? Um, and because one, it's not the liminal space of his house; it's the liminal space of the city, and I think that's really important because um, kind of that liminal space where Abraham was at kind of showed where his priorities were. And I think this liminal space where Lot is at really gives us a picture of where Lot's priorities are. And overall, I think the way that you can kind of um, understand the fundamental flaw of Lot is that he is um, he is a fundamentally good man that is trying to uphold an unjust system. That's what he's trying to do. And sort of everything that happens to him is the result of him trying to be a good man that is trying to preserve a system that really should not be preserved. And part of the story of Lot is about having the wisdom to know when to just abandon a bad system. Um, that's kind of what the whole thing is, right? Um, and we talked a lot about last time about, like, you know, did Abraham recognize uh like those men, and did he recognize uh the Lord whenever he showed up? And we already debated that here. But here it's pretty clear that Lot does not know that these guys that are showing up are angelic beings. He just thinks, as far as I can tell, he just thinks they're regular guys. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to keep them away from the rest of the men of the city, because he knows how wicked they are, right? Um, which demonstrates that this whole thing, like, it isn't a first. Um, it's not the first time that Lot has dealt with this. Um, uh, the other thing that I want to, so, and I'll make sure I'll talk about it here. We talked about it last week, but I'll make sure I talk about it here. Uh, there's always this kind of fundamental debate about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, about, like, what was the big sin? Was the big sin, if you're kind of more traditionally conservative, you say the big sin is like homosexuality, and that they're basically trying to rape the angels. Um, if you're on the more liberal progressive wing, you say that the fundamental sin is that has to do with, like, power dynamics, and that they are being inhospitable to the guest, to the foreigner. Um, and my stance is pretty much always that I, I don't think I don't think we're really supposed to be making a difference out of those two things. I think those two things are supposed to be linked, and both of those things are um, going on, and that both of those things are bad. Um, and as we go through this, I think that there's other multiple bad things that we don't always consider, and that I think that we should. Um, uh, okay, I was gonna say, so I already talked for a little bit. Does anybody want to say anything about um the angels, and I was gonna skip over kind of the leavened bread, but we're all tracking, following with where I'm at. Anything questions so far before we get into this next chapter? Or sorry, not next chapter, next paragraph. Okay. But before they lay down, right? Um, okay. So we already know that knowing them is a euphemism. Um, so the willingness to sacrifice his daughters. This is one of those things where, because the Bible is a narrative, it's it doesn't explicitly say whether or not this is a good thing or is this a bad thing that Lot is doing, right? Um, it's pretty obviously a bad thing that he has to do it, that he feels like that he has to do it. But is it a good thing that he's willing to sacrifice his daughters in order to protect these men? Well, if you frame it like that, it's probably yes. But I would also say that, like, he knows that this is a problem, right? He knew, right? That's my whole thing. Like, he knows that this is happening. That's why he's at the gate, right? Or at least that's my argument. That's what it seems to be happening. That he knows that this is a problem. He already knew that ahead of time, and so if you knew that ahead of time, you probably should have just already have taken your family and left instead of trying to protect protect the system. And so you end up having this weird, I think there's too many factors going on here um to say whether or not that this is actually like a good thing or bad thing. I think kind of any way that you slice it, it's ultimately a bad thing, and it's ultimately a bad thing that's a result of Lot's. What I'm going to say is that Lot seems to very much have a love for um what I always refer to as like the systems of man, for and what I refer to as like the Nephilim system, right? Like the systems that men set up, those hierarchical structures. Lot seems to have an innate um desire to be a part of that system. And I think the thing that you're supposed to get from this story, is that if you put that above, if you love the systems of men too much and are unwilling to um if you're unwilling to just not protect them, um they will end up consuming everything that you are, and so in this case they will end up consuming your daughters. They'll end up consuming your children. Um, and I think that that is supposed to be contrasted. And I'm going to jump around a little bit here. I think that's supposed to be contrasted, right, with the fact that, right, in the story prior to this, and actually currently, Abraham doesn't have any offspring, right? Lot has daughters, and in fact, also has sons-in-laws, or yeah, sons-in-law that are betrothed to his daughters, right? And actually, I kind of want to talk about these sons-in-law a little bit, because um, Abraham's fundamental problem has to do with the fact that he doesn't have he doesn't have a way to preserve his identity through time. And so he starts trying to um, take things upon himself to make that happen, instead of just allowing God to provide for him. Um, Lot has that method. Lot has uh, a future mapped out for him with his children, but that mapped out future is not directed towards God, and so is not directed towards his own identity. It's directed towards, well, the identity of the system, of the culture that he's in, right? And so, right, and I talked about how, right, because you have in previous chapters, God does this whole thing with circumcision, and how circumcision is about a preservation of identity. And and obviously the answer to this question is going to be no, but like, it, Lot's sons-in-law are not circumcised, obviously, right? And I'm not even trying to make the argument that they're like supposed to be, right? By like, because there's no covenant, like there's no covenant requirement for that made for Lot. But the story is supposed to be contrasted, and so that you see that Lot's sons-in-law are not committed to protecting his identity. They're not committed to protecting Lot's identity. If they were, they should have been doing something to stop this part up here, right? Like the whole thing where it says like, I can offer you my two daughters who have not known any man. Well, they're supposed to know some men. his sons-in-law that are down here, right? And so that like Lot is willing to sacrifice that future in order to preserve the system. And in fact, the sons-in-law seemingly are also willing to preserve that system and don't care about their future wives. It also begs the question, were the sons-in-law aware of what's going on here? Because it does say down to every last man. So were the sons-in-law also threatening Lot? Like, we don't know, right? It doesn't go that far. Um, uh, but I think this is supposed to be an example of just because, right? Just because the city is effective at giving you the material things, the material wealth, the actual connections to be able to establish a family that will go into the future, right? All of these things. Um, just because it provides those, if it is um, wrapped up in corruption and in sin, it ultimately is going to destroy you and consume you, and it won't do the thing that you want it to do. Um, and so I talked about how the point of circumcision is that it's a physical cutting off to prevent you from being cut off, and cut off meaning that you don't have children, that you don't have a future, that you don't have a family. Lot has a family and theoretically has already um, not been cut off. But as we see throughout this story, he actually, in a sense, is cut off from his family, and is ultimately cut off from uh, the line that his family comes from. Right? He's not in the line of Abraham because he's his nephew, so it'd be Terah, but still. Um, okay. Questions, comments about that portion?
Well, I want to throw this your way, and that is, um, if he, if Lot had too much reliance on the systems of man, um, I feel like that's a very sneaky sin that really any one of us can easily fall into. It's not like the most overt
Oh yeah, for sure.
sin, and so, and it's something that I think all of us can kind of look internally and go, yeah, we've definitely all probably struggle with that at some point. I can say definitively for myself that I have.
Oh, for sure.
And but I'm curious to know what your thoughts are in terms of like what are the signs that okay, I have too much reliance upon the systems of men, because the reality is we all use the systems of men.
Sure.
Like
Uh,
we're using it right now.
yes,
But
yes.
like so when have you crossed the line where it's
I'll,
like, okay,
I'll, I'll,
I
I'll,
need to check my heart.
I will take the easy route. Um, uh, it is, um, so the obvious one is, so, right, um, is what you're doing. So ultimately, right, I have this whole thing of ultimately everything is about allegiance. Everything is about allegiance. And so you can test yourself onto whether or not it's an allegiance question. And the way that this shows up in most of the Bible comes about with, um, right, like, so we might say, like, who's written on your heart? But the more practical way is like, um, what's written on your head and on your arms, right? And so this is where you get the whole like mark of the beast like discussion, right? And the mark of the beast fundamentally is a mark that is administered by the corrupt systems of men. And if you've heard me talk about this before, there are, in my opinion, there's not just one mark of the beast, although I think there will be, at the end times there will be one big one, but there are multiple marks of the beast, right? And And this and what the mark of the beast ultimately is it's a sign of allegiance. What is your allegiance to? And in exchange for you declaring your allegiance to us, we will then allow you to engage in commerce, do all of the things that the city, right, that the Systems of Man does for you, right? It's that allegiance question. And so once you start getting into like the okay, is this going to be an allegiance thing is the System of Man trying to put on an allegiance question on me? Um, and that's not always super clear, but like for me, it I think it's sort of obvious that like a lot of the COVID stuff for especially like vaccine and vaccine passports and all that stuff. It's like this is approaching like that's a mark of the beast kind of a thing, right? It's a this doesn't actually do anything. This isn't actually like a this isn't actually a thing that's like for anyone's good. It's just being done to demonstrate compliance. Like, we want you to do this thing to demonstrate that you will listen to us, which actually is the same thing that's going on, right? Bring them out to us so that we may know them. Bring them out here so that they can demonstrate that they are willing to be compliant to us, right? Once you start getting into stuff that does that, that is like an allegiance thing. That is a power struggle thing. Um, and and I think that's where you start to be able to draw the line into okay, is this a question of and it's not always, and I agree with what you said, it's not always super clear, but I think sometimes it's more clear than others, if that makes sense. Um,
I wanted to add on to that because I had that thought um, of liking it to that, likening it to that move of the systems of man's proclivity to want to subjugate, to dominate, and to have a system of totality, and that's evident in the line of saying that it was both young and old, all the people to the last
yeah,
man. So this is a system that encompasses the entire city. Um, and then there's probably um, depending on how you want to look into this, there's a lot of subtext that's not being explained or enumerated or listed out here, and the motivations are only as clear as the dialogue lets them be,
right.
um, because they we hear what the men of the city want, and then we hear that it's wicked from Lot's reply, but we don't actually get their stated motivation. Um, but one thing I just was thinking of on this reading is because of its totality, it could be a kind of ritual thing of a ritual domination. This is a thing that this city does. Hence the reason why, Lot's like, hey, don't come in here. Uh,
Right.
this is what they do. Um, and also the very reason why the offering of the daughters is insufficient, because that would mean that these two men are still left subjugated. Uh,
Well, it brings up some other things too, right? And so that you said that I didn't mention. So one, it brings up the question of did they do something similar to Lot? I don't know. um, the other thing that I actually didn't talk about, that I meant to, that I skipped over in my notes accidentally, is this fellow came to sojourn and he has become the judge. So if they didn't do this to Lot, did they not do it to him because he's a sojourner and so they know that he's going to leave, right? but they don't know that necessarily about these men. So what's going on there? Regardless, that line about this fellow came to sojourn and he has become the judge, in my opinion, is also kind of a meta ironic statement, because fundamentally that is what the Israelites are there to do. Actually, they are coming into the land as sojourners, and their job is to judge the land, actually. And so that actually is like the thing that they are fundamentally mad about is the thing that they are supposed to be, that the Israelites at least are supposed to be doing. Um and and so there's a little bit of a commentary in there, I think, about, yeah, um you Israelite who are reading this, um you are supposed to be judging the corruption of these foreign societies, and be trying to maintain it in a proper way, um, like Lot is doing, but also a little bit of a commentary about how you're probably not going to do it correctly, because to me, one of the, like, it's so strange that we have this story, right? But then we also have a story in Israelite history where almost the same exact thing happens, right? Um, I forget where it is, and again, if I had done my job better and I had looked up better, but right, there's the story of like the Israelite priest, or the Levite priest, who I believe has a concubine, and he, like, he goes into a town, and like I think they want to rape him or something. I might have that part of it wrong. And he gives them the concubine, and they kill the concubine. And in rage, he chops up the concubine, sends it to the corners of Israel. A bunch of people come together and they destroy the city, right? And they're pretty clearly supposed to be a parallel in those stories, but also in that story is also, I think, is a bunch of examples of a bunch of people doing things wrong, and in this story is a bunch of examples of a bunch of people doing things wrong. Um, and I also want to highlight here how I mentioned before that ultimately I don't think that this story needed to have taken place, because if Abraham had just never separated from Lot, um, Lot would have never gotten put into this position. Um, and so I think there's a little bit of like, there's something there that needs to be thought about. Sorry, I didn't know if you had more you wanted to say, Evan.
No, not much more on that point.
Okay.
Yeah, you can continue.
Okay. Um. So one of the other things that I wanted to highlight is the line about um. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? This is kind of a mirror debate conversation to, and actually even in some of the language that Lot has with these angels that Abraham had with Yahweh, right? About like, oh, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and all this stuff. Like, can you take it easy? Right? And and can you take it easy in such a way to preserve my kind of perverse love of the systems of man, right? Um, that's essentially what he's doing here, right? He's arguing to, oh, don't make me go to the hills, don't make me go to the wilderness, right? And also, all of this story should whenever we see these stories in the gospels in the New Testament of whenever Jesus is separating out and going out into the wilderness and not going to the cities, right? And he's making a separation, like that's related to all of this stuff too. um he's saying, no, don't make me go to the hills, let me just go to this small city. And you know the angels acquiesce and go, you know what, sure, that's fine. And it's kind of a similar result. Um, it's kind of a similar result to the Abraham one. But to me, kind of one of the things that's funny about it is, and the Abraham one, like Abraham wins. Well, and actually, in kind of all these situations, right? Abraham wins, but he doesn't win because there's not 10 righteous people. Lot wins in this debate about whether or not he can go to Zoar, and he does. But he's so freaked out. He's so freaked out about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah that he goes, Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his two daughters, right? So he's so freaked out about the destruction that actually takes place that he goes, oh crud, maybe I shouldn't. And right, and it says, right, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. And so we don't know why he's afraid to live in Zoar. Maybe Zoar scared him because people there were doing things like they were in Sodom and Gomorrah, but that's probably not it, because he wasn't scared to live in Sodom and Gomorrah. He was doing that. What he's probably scared of is he's probably scared that God's going to decide to destroy Zoar like he was originally intending to. And so it's probably afterwards that he decides, oh crud, he really did like just wipe them all out. I should go ahead and listen to that angel and actually go up into the hills. Um, and so even though he won the argument, he didn't ultimately he didn't ultimately win, which is a similar structure. Um, I wasn't going to talk too much about his wife becoming a pillar of salt. Um, other than it just goes along with the rest of the theme of the whole thing. And it's one of the things that I think, you know, a lot of times whenever like you learn the story of Sodom and Gomorrah as a young kid, um, it's usually kind of painted that like Lot's the good guy and the wife is the one that like loved the city too much. But I think that the thing that we can see is that actually Lot loves the city too much as well. He just manifested it in different ways from what his wife did. and and in both cases it leads to um uh I'll say a form of stagnation, a form of being cut off. Um and the way that that shows up for Lot is ultimately in the whole incest that takes place here, and the birth of two nations that are fundamentally going to be at odds with uh with his family, right? um and that's really kind of the point of the story, right? Like his family did go on, right? But his identity doesn't go on, right? Like Moab and the Ammonites don't identify themselves with Lot, right? They're not Lotian. They're not branches of Lot's of the line of Lot, right? They're identified with Moab, or they're identified with the Amorites with Ben-Ammi, like that's who they're identified with. They're not really identified with Lot, um, and so therefore they're not really identified with this line, with this plan that God has going on with Abraham. Instead, they're separated out from that, and so that is that is how um, your love of evil systems will ultimately be affecting like your future generations, right? That's how that like connection I think is supposed to be made. Okay. Anything about anything in the chapter? We'll open it up to questions or anything that people want to bring up.
Um, this is interesting, Kyle, because I guess the narrative that I was always told was that he gave up his daughters because he recognized that they were angels, but the text never says that.
No, it
So
doesn't. And
that was always
really, I would argue that they probably, I would argue that Lot doesn't know that they have any angelic abilities until he blinds them, until he blinds all the people, right? Which happens after he offers his daughters, right? Um, and so it's like once they start throwing out flashbangs, then he knows, oh, okay, these guys are serious, and oh, okay, they probably can destroy the city, but he obviously doesn't know to what like full effect. Um, and actually, again, I jumped over some other stuff in my notes. One of the things that I wanted to highlight is, and then the Lord, right, Yahweh, rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from Yahweh out of heaven, right? And so, um, this is one of the spots where Michael Heiser brings up the whole idea of the two powers in heaven. And remember that in the previous chapter, one of the angels is referred to as Yahweh, and it's the one that's speaking to Abraham. These ones are not referred to as that, and they're talking to Lot. And it says, uh, right, and then so it has like Yahweh that's down low, right? Um, he is raining down on Sodom and Gomorrah fire and sulfur from the Yahweh that is in heaven. And so you have this is an example of uh, there there being two Yahwehs, and it's similar in effect to and it becomes a similar picture to um, when Jesus is being baptized and God is in heaven and descending down on him like a dove is the Holy Spirit, right? Um, and so if you just read it like that, it's a right. You have two instances here, whereas in the New Testament one, there's three. And so if you want to play the game of, well, where's the Holy Spirit in this one? Um, that would make the Holy Spirit the fire and the sulfur, which I think is just a funny idea. But obviously, there'd be a little bit of anachronistic reading back into the text to get that. But it's very clear that at least the two Yahwehs are there in this picture.
that makes sense to me, Kyle, because and I've been looking up the Trinity recently,
Mm-hmm.
and just his nature, and you have three distinct persons, but Jesus is for always eternally coming from the Father,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting. So but you actually see like his nature in different parts of scripture, and that seems to be consistent. But I don't know about the Holy Spirit and the sulfur part, but I don't know how that works.
Well, you always have at least I was always taught that if you feel convicted, it's that it's the Holy Spirit that's convicting you, and so that's what the fire and the brimstone is. It's conviction. Uh, Sodom and Gomorrah were being convicted. Um, I don't know, but
Hey, I
Uh,
just wanted, I wanted to piggyback something you and Evan were talking about earlier.
okay.
And Evan pointed out that maybe potentially, um, this was part of their culture. Like the way that it was, I wouldn't say an initiation rite, but almost like, oh, we haven't done it to that guy yet. Let's go. And, a couple thoughts on that. Number one is like in the previous chapter, depending on how you look at Jesus, pre-incarnate, post-incarnate, whatever you want to say, in
Yeah.
chapter 18, um, Jesus basically says, I have to go check out Sodom. I got to
Yeah.
see the evil that's happening. And of course, like, we talked about what that meant exactly last week, but I kind of think there may have been like when you could argue that when the angels went, the messengers went, that they that there was this rumor floating around in the heavenlies or something
Yep.
that in Sodom, when sojourners and foreigners come into their land, they're basically raped by the men in the land. So we're gonna go check it out,
Yeah.
and we're gonna see if that actually happens. And sure enough, it does, and it's like, okay. It's not as though God was not aware of it, but there's something about when God visits a place and they still don't change, even though holiness entered into their midst, then it's kind of like I blinded your eyes, and yet you still did not recognize that there was divine power in your midst.
So this is something that I was debating about whether or not I was going to talk about. So I think what you're bringing up here is actually somewhat related to, um, right. So what they say is bring them out to us that we may know them. And one of the things that I've tried to talk about a lot, right? Because like we all know that means like have sex with them, but that's not like, but that idiom is not always used in the Bible, right? And more often than not, when that idiom is used, it's actually used to mean something a little bit more than like just sex. Like right, like it's
Like
used for
reproduction.
like it's used for Adam and Eve. Like it's used
Right.
for like very like in
well, it's not used colloquially like the later times typically. I think it's also typically used like at the first instance, like consummating a marriage or around
right.
those
Well,
times.
and
Not always to refer to the act every time
and
it
like
happens,
and
typically.
like and as far as I can tell, whenever it's more casual, like so, like whenever you get to like the like with like prostitutes, it'll just say like, and they went into them, right? It'll use that kind of a phrasing to um to talk about like sex, and it's not clear to me 100% whether or not that, but it's almost in the way. I think it's similar to how like modern people will talk about the difference between like having sex and like making love, right? We have like in some ways when you use the euphemism, we mean it as like a more real thing, or as like a more intimate kind of idea, and it's strange that that's sort of what they're doing here. They're using the euphemism, but in like a more corrupt way. Um, and I think that is linked to the idea uh, of knowing, of practical knowing. And so, to kind of what you're saying, like there's this whole thing of like, again, a little bit of like meta irony with like what they're saying here. It's like, oh, and it's also related to like the idea of hell, right? And so like we have this idea of people have this idea of um like the fire in hell, or like it is it comes from the same source as like the light of heaven, right? Like they both come from God. Just whether or not it's pleasant to be in or is painful to be in is based off of your disposition, like to God, right? This is kind of an idea that gets floated around there. And um this is sort of a picture of that, because it's like they're like, oh, we want to know these angels. And it's like, oh, well, if you really wanted to know God, you would die. And that's actually what's going to happen to them. And it's right. It's a little bit of that. It's one of the few like almost kind of places where, because right, we have this idea with Moses, and it shows up with other places of like, when you see God, you like people die. Whenever they see God, they die. Um, and I've always thought that it's a little bit ironic, because almost nowhere in Scripture does that actually happen. Well, in some ways, you could argue that kind of is happening here, right? Like the whole city um, is seeing God, is seeing Yahweh, and it's killing them. And it's because of like their wickedness. And so there is a little bit of that. There's something going on there with um, knowledge of God being at play, uh, and how and why they're punished. Um, I know I interrupted you a little bit there, Christian, but
No, that's good. The last thing I was gonna say was that I also liked, just piggybacking on the whole cultural thing, that maybe this was part of their culture. This is what they did, and just like any culture, you're gonna have the leaders and you're gonna have the followers. And I know, this is kind of speculation, but I have to imagine that you're gonna, when the whole city comes and is knocking on Lot's door, that you kind of have a mixed bag there of people who are like, they're the leaders, and then you have the people who are kind of like, yeah, this is the thing we do. I don't love it, but this is our culture. But guess what? They all get destroyed. Bec-
yeah.
because like everybody's culpable, whether you're the leader or you're the follower. You're called to righteousness, whether and so that's just kind of a side thought I had.
Just because you're not ecstatic about the gang rape, you will be punished for it.
Right.
Yeah,
And I look at like even the whole, you mentioned like the COVID experiment, 5, 6 years ago now.
yeah,
And you kind of saw that in society. You saw the
yeah,
people
yeah,
who where they were like rabidly for their cause.
yeah,
And then you saw the ones that just were kind of like, oh, whatever happens, I'm just gonna kind of go along with
yeah.
whatever. And you see it really in everything, abortion and LGBTQ movement and just all these different movements. And at the end of the day, I think God looks at it and goes, you're called to stand
So,
against unrighteousness,
okay. So actually, now that you like, as soon as you said that, it like clicked in my head that I'm like, oh, now I know what I'm like. Now I know what I'm reminded of what I saw. So like on X this week, there was a right, because people post like junk from TikTok or whatever on X, and there was a clip of this woman who uh, so I guess does OnlyFans or something like that, and she's like filming herself, and her dad is in the background, and she goes, hey dad, like her audience wants to know, are you proud of are you proud of me even though I'm an OnlyFans actress? And the guy goes off and is like, yes, I am. And he has this whole thing about how he's proud of her and all this stuff, and all he really cares about is she happy and healthy and like all of this stuff. And like a minute into it, he talks about like, I'm a journalist and all that stuff, and my takeaway was just like, oh yeah, man, you're really just proving that journalists are not humans. um uh but it was just such a clear example of like, oh, you are a person who is totally captured by society, that you don't care that that society is eating your children. Like, that's terrifying. That's really terrifying. And 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 it happens. I think it happens in a lot of ways. And we we have this kind of, and it's not like that guy didn't invent porn or anything like that, right? Like he's like, as far as I know, he's not on OnlyFans paying like, he's not actively engaging in it as far as I can tell. But his passive, like, permission of it, and just, oh well, you're healthy, like, on a superficial level, is like, oh, that's a protection mechanism for this evil thing. And it that's really not a good road to be going down. um yeah. Because that only grows the evil. um which in some ways I think sort of answers the question from last week, right? Because we had right? God asked the question last week of, should I show Abraham what I'm about to do to Sodom and Gomorrah? And I think whenever you think about what I just said, it's like, oh, that's why Abraham needed to see it, and that's why it needed to be written in the Bible, is because we needed to see that, like, God really does punish evil. He really does punish wickedness, and it won't stand, and it will it will destroy everything that, like, it touches. And so don't don't play footsie with it, I guess. I think is the takeaway. Um Anything else? Thank you all for coming. um Thank you for being here, Miles.
Yeah, it's burning outside, so
Yeah, there's
now we
nothing else
can.
going on.
Yeah. No, I just don't. I've been busy like everybody else.
There's fire and sulfur coming down outside.
Literally. Yeah, quite literally. If I go outside, I might bust.
The last thing I want to say, and this is kind of a joke thing, but the verse 20, um, this is my favorite in talking about in Lot's little aside to himself. This is one of my favorite
Oh
examples of like a Trumpism in the Bible.
yeah.
Um, just like pointing out a city, he goes, "Is it not a little city?" And then if you look at the definition of Zohar,
Oh yeah.
um,
It's a little
uh,
city. Yeah.
it's little, it's little city. It's like
Yeah.
it's so little. I'm gonna call it little city.
Yeah.
I view that as the very clear
Well, and,
like
and
Trump
and
voice
again,
coming through there.
is one of those things that, like, just one of those things that Step Bible used to be good for, is it would actually tell you like the name meaning of the cities, but now it doesn't. I don't know why they got rid of that feature. It was one of the best
Oh man.
features about Step Bible, and they got rid of it. But yes, that is why it's there, and therefore the name is called Zoar, which is just little city. Yeah,
Yeah.
just like little town, little nothing. All right. Well, so we have next week is chapter 20. And then I believe, yeah, so next week is chapter 20. So we have next week, and then we have the following week, and then we'll be done with Genesis. And I'll go ahead and say this again because I don't think everybody was here than the last time that I said it. Once we're done with Genesis, I'm going to do a little break where we talk about hell. And the main point of this is to try and help me. One, I need to make a better video about my specific view of hell, but it will also help me get together a lot of my arguments, both for and against my view. And that will probably take, I'm estimating, 4 weeks. We'll see how it really goes. And then after that, we'll end up picking what we want to do next. I know Diego was pushing for one of the prophets, which I still think is probably a good idea. I don't know if you're still pushing for that, Diego. But that's probably where I'm going to start looking at and leaning into.
I put the campaign ads on hold, so I'm on standby.
Oh, okay. But if not that, or even if we do that, the other thing that we would do is one of the Gospels, and it would probably be Matthew. I already did Mark, and so I think that would be the direction I'd want to go.
Do you have any
I'm
thoughts?
I'm equally
Like, if
fine
you
with that too.
Sorry, go ahead, Christian.
I was just gonna say, do you have if you ended up going with one of the prophets, do you have any like books in mind?
My gut says either Ezekiel or Daniel.
Okay. Ezekiel, what is that, like almost 50 chapters or something like that? And then
Yeah. Well,
Daniel, I think, is 12, right?
yeah, and that's part of it too. Is like, do I want to do this for a full year?
Another good book is Zechariah is also kind of an interesting book too.
But I
So-
feel like if I pick Malachi, like it's cheating. Or
Why? What is that, like 5 chapters or something like
yeah,
that?
it's like I think it's like 2 or 3.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's like
Go with Jude.
yeah, exactly.
Jude, we could do
Um,
Jude. Jude's
Sorry,
good.
what were you saying, Diego?
I just said I'm equally okay with doing a gospel because
Ah,
you can never overdo reading the gospels.
this is true. This is true.
And Matthew's got no end of interesting takes too, like his numbers and all that stuff. So
Well, and part of why I wanted to do Matthew is because I think of all of the 4 gospels, Matthew is the most liberal with his use of the Old Testament. And I don't mean in just that like he references a lot, which he does, but I just mean like he references it in ways that like you probably weren't expecting. and at least in definitely ways that like Jews weren't expecting. And so there's a lot of like, are you allowed to do that? And he's like, well, he did. So like, what are you going to do about it? Um, and so in that way, I think that Matthew is really interesting. But yeah, so thank you so much. Stay safe out there. Don't breathe the demonic air.